What's going on, guys? I'm CFBKings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in. Hope you're all doing well. So I was watching the NFL draft this past weekend, waiting to see where some of the players that we've watched for the last 3 to 6 years would be continuing their football careers, and I realized that I have a slight issue with the way that draft picks and some other accolades are being attributed in the current college football era. So with the transfer portal and the fact that it has virtually zero restriction whatsoever, and the most recent change to the portal making it even less structured than it was before, players can kind of hop from team to team without really any sort of system to it. If you follow the Instagram page, you're probably aware of my stance toward the portal and how I don't necessarily like where things are at with it and how quickly we've gone from needing a waiver and needing to sit out a year and transfers being the outliers among players to now you can transfer anytime, as many times as you want. There's no sitting out a year. There's no reason needed. And then there's how much money and NIL and tampering is involved with the average transfer decision now. It's all just kind of a mess. But the recruiting and college football company On3 actually put out a tweet earlier that said over 3,600 players have entered the portal in this most recent cycle, which is just a crazy number to even think about. But we have coaches having to recruit not only players from high school and then whoever's in the portal, but they have to recruit their own players not to take a deal from a different school and leave. We have group of 5 teams being rated of their best talent. Nick Saban actually admitted to attempting to do so during coverage of the draft this past weekend. He sort of offhand said that Alabama tried to get Quinyon Mitchell, a DB from Toledo who went in the first round, to leave the Rockets and join the Crimson Tide. And if you're unfamiliar with that process, teams aren't allowed to contact players who aren't in the portal, which Mitchell never was. Even though I think Nick Saban is the best coach in the history of our sport and I like him a lot, that's not great. That's not a great look. But we have high school players being offered spots that don't exist by the time they get to campus with how many transfers schools are taking now. And that's not to say that I don't think players should be able to transfer under certain circumstances, but just significantly less frequently than they are now and with more structure to the whole process. To put it mildly, it's not my favorite part of our sport. But I was watching the draft and noticed how many players who were getting drafted had spent significant time at a previous school, if not multiple, before they arrived at the school whose name was being called alongside theirs during the pick announcements. And I started thinking about how some schools are kind of getting robbed of the credit and the stat for the draft pick for a lot of the picks in this current era, just because a player decided to transfer for their final season of football and is now the product of a different school, basically. So I went through the first few rounds of the draft and picked out a few players who had significant playing time and relevant stats with multiple schools while they were in college. One of the first that I noticed during the draft was Braden Fisk, who had most recently played for Florida State in the 2023 season, but before joining the Seminoles, Fisk played at Western Michigan for 4 years. Fisk had a great year with the Seminoles, but the majority of what he put on film for the NFL came while he was at Western Michigan. In his career, he had 19.5 total sacks. 6 of those were at Florida State. He had 36 total tackles for loss. 9 of them were at Florida State. He had 191 total tackles. 43 were at FSU. He had 3 pass deflections. 0 of them were at FSU. And he had 3 forced fumbles and 2 fumble recoveries. None of them were at Florida State. So as I go through these players, none of this is to say that Florida State or any of the schools who had these guys drafted after accepting them as a transfer shouldn't get that credit, but the school who the players were with prior to transferring are kind of getting robbed a little bit and should also get some sort of recognition for their recruitment and development of these NFL draft picks. Wide receiver Jacob Cowing of Arizona, but formerly of UTEP, was another one that stood out. In his career, Cowing had 4,447 receiving yards, 2,595 of which were at UTEP, and 1,882 yards were at Arizona. The most productive year of Cowing's career was in 2021 at UTEP, where he had 69 receptions for 1,354 yards and 7 touchdowns, averaging 19.6 yards per catch. He also had 4 rushes for 75 yards and a touchdown, averaging 18.8 yards per rush. This past season at Arizona, Cowing had 90 receptions for 848 yards and 13 touchdowns, averaging 9.4 yards per catch. So 21 more receptions, but for 506 less yards. And he did find the end zone a lot more, though, with 13 touchdowns. And also for these examples, we do have to factor in the level of opposition and the difference in caliber of teams that the players experience going from, in this case, Conference USA to the Pac-12. In his career, Cowing averaged 18.4 yards per catch at UTEP and 10.8 yards per catch at Arizona. Great seasons at both schools, but it definitely feels like a situation where UTEP should get some credit for the draft pick and their scouting, recruitment, and development of Cowing. Another example is wide receiver Jamari Thrash out of Louisville, but formerly of Georgia State. He was with Georgia State for 4 years in 2019, 20, 21, and 22 before ending his career with the Cardinals in 2023. He was a top-level commodity in the transfer portal last year after his 1,100-yard season with Georgia State in 2022. In his career, Thrash had 2,610 receiving yards, but just 858 of them were at Louisville. He had 18 receiving touchdowns, 6 of them were at Louisville, and he had 167 receptions, 63 were at Louisville. Another situation where Georgia State scouted Thrash, they recruited him, they landed him, they developed him into a 1,000-yard receiver, but then he leaves for his final season of college football, and they get no credit for the draft pick. And it's hard enough for programs like Georgia State to recruit as it is right now, but it'll be that much harder if all of their NFL prospects are being taken away for their final season or two, and they can't point to those draft picks as a recruiting tool. Of course, they can still say, like, look, Jamari Thrash was here for 4 years. He went from a low 3-star recruit with just a handful of FBS offers to being one of the most coveted receivers in the transfer portal and a 5th-round NFL draft pick, but not having the ability to directly show these are the NFL draft picks that we've had is unfortunate for a lot of these smaller schools. And I'm not sure if there will be a way for these schools to get that credit or recognition on future draft nights or in historical recordings of where each pick came from. But if you come up with any ideas or potential solutions as you're listening, feel free to comment them below. I really want to know what your thoughts on this are. Another example is Tyke Smith from Georgia, but prior to that, he was with West Virginia. And this one is a little bit different than the others since Smith has been with Georgia for a little while now, but his production was almost split 50-50 in the 2 seasons that he played with the Mountaineers and the 2 seasons that he played with the Dogs. In his career, Smith had 137 tackles, 69 with West Virginia and 68 with Georgia. He had 212 total tackles, 111 with West Virginia and 101 with Georgia. He had 21.5 tackles for loss, 10.5 with West Virginia, 11 with Georgia. He had 8 interceptions, 4 at each school, and he had 12 pass deflections, 9 at West Virginia, 3 at Georgia, and then lastly he had 1 pick six at West Virginia and then 0 at Georgia. But again, for all of these, I'm not saying that the pick should count for one or the other, but that it should count as a pick for Georgia and in some way as one for West Virginia too. And like I said before, this one is a little different since his last season with the Mountaineers was in 2020 and he's being drafted in 2024. But he had a season-ending injury and didn't play at all in 2021 after transferring to Georgia. So he played with West Virginia in 2019 and 2020 and with Georgia in 2022 and 23. But his on-field production for film and for NFL scouts that I listed off was almost dead even, if not more so, while he was at West Virginia. I've got a few more here. Eric All from Iowa, but he spent 4 years at Michigan before transferring to the Hawkeyes. And not that Michigan was in need of any more picks in this year's draft. They had the most of any team with 13. But Eric All had 75 total receptions in his career, 54 at Michigan, 21 at Iowa. He had 864 total yards receiving, 565 at Michigan, 299 at Iowa. And he had 5 touchdowns, 2 at Michigan, 3 at Iowa, and a lot of what he's being drafted on is his measurables and blocking ability and stuff like that, but just from a stat standpoint, he had significant production at both schools. And lastly, Tez Walker from North Carolina, and before he was a Tar Heel, he was a Kent State Golden Flash. He was only able to play in 8 games last year for North Carolina because for some reason his transfer situation was the only one in which the NCAA felt like caring about and wouldn't allow him to play in the first few games of the season until they finally caved in, I think, week 4. But in his career, Walker had 104 receptions, 63 at Kent State, 41 with North Carolina. He had 1,744 receiving yards, 1,045 at Kent State, 699 at UNC. He had 20 total touchdowns, 13 at Kent State, 7 at UNC, and he averaged 16.6 yards per catch at Kent State and 17 yards per catch at UNC. And there were a bunch of others that I noticed, but I think you get the idea. We're still navigating all the changes in college football that have come over the past 5 or so years and the adjustment period and everything between the transfer portal becoming a thing and NIL being introduced and all of the conference realignment where players are transferring to get into the Power 4 and stuff like that. But this was just something that I noticed while I was watching the draft, and I feel like a lot of the smaller programs like Western Michigan and UTEP and Georgia State and Kent State, but even schools like West Virginia are sort of getting robbed of some of the credit for draft picks of players that they recruited and developed. And it's interesting, especially for West Virginia. Marshall, the Thundering Herd, actually put out a graphic the other day touting their draft picks and how they had the most of any team in the Virginias, one more than West Virginia. So some of the credit for the Tyke Smith pick could have been significant in that regard for the Mountaineers. But like I said earlier, let me know what your thoughts are on this. If you feel the same, if you don't, if you have a potential solution to how these schools could get some credit for their involvement in the selection of these players into the NFL, I really want to know what your perspective is on it. And on the other hand, though, there's definitely a lot of situations where players leave one school and go to another, and what they're able to accomplish at their second stop is really what garners them that NFL attention, and what they did at their first stop probably wouldn't have gotten them into the NFL draft. Like Michael Penix, for example, what he did at Indiana certainly wouldn't have had him as the number 8 overall pick in this year's draft, but what he was able to do at Washington, where he excelled and succeeded and threw for, I believe, 4,500 yards in back-to-back seasons, which was some type of record. That was obviously very, very influential in getting him into that pick, and what he had done at Indiana wasn't as significant. Bo Nix, for example, at Auburn, he certainly wasn't bad with the Tigers, but what he was able to do with the Ducks is really what had him in position to be a top 10 pick. There's a lot of other examples like that where the second school really is responsible for them being drafted, and the first school shouldn't receive that credit. But there's also a lot of situations, like I pointed out before, where the original school had them in position to potentially be that in the same spot in the NFL draft. But if you love college football like I do and want year-round coverage of it, if you want to hear about it more than just for a couple months in the fall, make sure to follow CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram, where I post about college football every single day. The 2024 season will be here before we know it, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you guys. And as we lead up to it, I'm going to be releasing episodes of the show about once a week. And then once we're in the 2024 season itself, I'll be releasing multiple episodes per week, talking about everything that the season may hold. That's all that I had. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel on YouTube or wherever you're listening on podcast, and come back next time for some more college football content. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.